I will be showing you. Okay. Good morning, LSA. Good morning. Hi, Ellen, can you hear me?
We use our system unless one of us uses earpiece.
Good morning, LSA. Can anyone hear me? Good morning, good morning. I am saying good morning, but it's afternoon in Nigeria. So, hi, everyone. Good afternoon in Nigeria. Good morning from Georgia. I just want to be sure that someone can hear me. So if you can hear me, could you please let me know? Is that a yes from LSA? Because I cannot hear you.
Okay. Yeah.
I can hear you. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, Tolu. I want to be sure you can also hear me. All right, so I think we would really have to start, so we're able to get through all of that. I hope everyone is doing okay. For everyone at LLSA in person, if you're watching, thank you for joining our panel, because we know that other panels are running concurrently, so we're grateful that you're here with us. Thank you to every other person who is attending from all over, everyone online. I can see who is attending, but I'm just like connecting with everyone and saying hello and sending warm greetings. Thank you so much. So this is our panel on gendering midwifery in Africa. And we are all like really excited to talk about midwifery in general in Africa, and then using gender as an entry point, and then using decolonial approaches. We all know that we are all here at LSA this session really talking about decolonizing, right? So here we are decolonizing childbirth, maternal, infant health, and everything that concerns like women's health. So thank you for joining us. So with me today, I have our other 4 presenters. So we have 5 presentations in total. So we're going to go quickly so we can have enough time for questions and answers, right? And we're going to go in the order on the program. So I am going to be starting my presentation first, and then we'll be introducing other speakers so they can really go ahead with their presentation. So I'm going to introduce myself. I'm going to do my presentation, and then I'll introduce each person who is going to go after my presentation. Okay, all right. So my presentation today is really getting into gender analysis on midwifery, and I'm going to use Southwest Nigeria as a case study, and I'm using the Yoruba midwives, and I'm putting midwives in quotes because, right, just like to just apply to women like wife, mothers. We are just like using it, and part of decolonizing in this project for me is to also like decolonize terminologies and labels and see how people actually describe themselves, what they would really like to be called, as opposed to just like fitting them into globalized languages, and just like for maybe just to say colonized terminologies that really do not get into what goes on the ground in Nigeria, Southwest, in my own particular case. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I hope that that works. All right, because technology has really me some things today. So I'm not sure if you can see my screen, and I am not sure which of the screen that you're seeing. Is everyone able to see my slide? See if I can present.
Yeah. We can see your
Okay.
screen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that confirmation. I appreciate that, because I cannot see it. You can see it? That's interesting, because it's just showing that it's just loading for me. Okay, now I can see it too. So I'm talking about contemporary traditional midwifery in Nigeria, and I am going to be talking about the gender and decolonized perspectives this morning. Right. And so this is a paper, like a chapter actually, book manuscript, which is being developed from my dissertation. So my dissertation was broadly on indigenous birthing approaches and epistemologies in Africa and using Nigeria and the Yoruba Southwest part as case study. And so part of the thing that came up for me was to really see the Baba babies. So I went into that research to just speak with the mama agbebis, the women, Nigerian women, Yoruba women who are agbebis, who help women to, care for their pregnancy and help with their child delivery. And I also just did my IRB and just wanted to look at women. I knew there were like a few men midwives, quote unquote, or what the globalized people would just call the traditional birth attendants. I knew there were a few male among them because I grew up in the Ebutemeta Yaba zone in Lagos. So I've seen a few of them. But for me, it was just like, oh, maybe they're just assisting. I didn't take it seriously and just like went into my research with that blind spot of like, I was just going to speak with the women and actually put it in my IRB to say, okay, I know there are a few men, but this is largely women's work and I'm just going to speak with the women because I'm also in women's and gender studies. So I'm like, okay, let's just focus. Let's take this particular group. But it was just like really fascinating that any birther, like the women, the pregnant women, the women who've had child, delivered with a traditional birth attendants, right, would always talk about, some will talk about their men midwives, and then some of the women midwives will talk about men midwives who they work with, or their fathers who step down this training for them, who groomed them in this work. And we'll talk about the men who they work together. I'm like, oh, okay, I think this is really a lot. So I had to put in questions to ask more and had to revise to speak with the men. And I was able to speak, with like 15 of them, and still was in Nigeria last summer to speak with a lot of them. So this is something that I think that we need to pay attention to, especially because like what is popular is that midwifery is women's work, and that's just the assumption that goes into research on African midwifery as well, and just like how we engage from that streamlined perspective. So today I'm just using that decolonized framework, right? And when I say decolonize, is to think about the colonial impact on midwifery in Africa, but to also think about what we have contemporarily, and then with that understanding, see what it needs to be and how we can continue to engage and learn from all of the things that we tend to have forgotten from our historical and cultural context, and use that to, one, critique the globalized framework, which is marginalizing traditional midwifery in general, but also the men midwives in particular in the case of Southwest Nigeria. We can make that argument about Africa, but of course we know that Africa is not a monolith. It's not just a single object of research. So one of the things for me is also to see how people are thinking about gender in other African settings, in other African countries, in other African cultures, and see what this means by and large, and be able to insert that into the conversation, into the discourse, right, in terms of methods and research in maternal midwifery. And I think for me overall, I always like to make this clear that it's not just about looking at historical cultural context and the contemporary happenings, but for me it's more like all the lessons that we can gather from all of these to improve maternal health and reduce maternal mortality for Nigeria, which, if we want to go by the WHO statistics, has the third highest global maternal mortality ratio, and that is really big. And this is really like moved up to third highest from when I was just doing my dissertation like 2 years ago, where it was like, okay, the 2015 report, MDG report before we transitioned to SDG was like fourth highest, now it's third highest. And I'm like, oh, things are evolving, things are happening. We really need to look at this approach, this issue, right, maternal health, maternal mortality issue, from dimensional approaches in terms of research and dialogue and conversation and strategies. Right. So I think I've said a whole lot about this. So this particular article really specifically said there is no language that describes, midwife, men midwife, right? You would have to put something in front of it. And it was so categorical. And I'm like, okay, well, let's back up a little bit. Let's back up a little bit. There are, people in Southwest Nigeria who have names for this things and who are men, right? And who have developed this work this sort of birth work from generation to generation, right? Some of the ones that I met would like to just call themselves traditional birth attendants because they received training and they're trying to also work with the Lagos state government to sort of like be recognized, right? So like, okay, this is how you want to be described. And some will say, well, I didn't go for the training and I'm still known as Baba Baby, right? And so that's what they want to be called. But to just put it out there that we have to critique some of these assumptions that, well, it's midwife, and even doula also, its etymology is connected to women who stay with women during childbirth, women who help women. So it's more like women to women, more like women helping women. But we've seen that historically from my research, there have been men in this birthing work business, well, or just birth work, because I don't like to call it business just from saying how they as communal, as supporting the community, and for them it's not just about the money, this service, right? And for them it's a matter of life and death, and helping to bring about new births, right, new lives into their community, right? And this research on gender in midwifery framework for me also connects with the existing conversation on the gender as colonial creation, as Professor Yehumi would want us to see how this is something that we acquired, right? And over time just seems to be like, well, it's been there, but has it always been there? Has this gendered relation always been there? And that's one of the things I'm questioning in this. Has it just been known as women's work, or have men always been there and it was just as a result of colonial interruption that we now see it as women's work, right? And not just men's work, right? And I also want to just use that to demarginalize African men who are indigenous midwives and who are in birth work, but to also promote this continuous reclaiming of African concepts of communal, engaging, participatory, and as I am finding out, gender neutral birth work, right? Which has excluded men in over time, so bringing them into the narrative, demarginalizing them, right? So really, I know time is running by. My journey into this, I think I've also just explained this and how I met the men and the women and all. And one of the things that also prompted me was I've been trained as a doula in the US, and also engaging in Black maternal health and epistemologies in the US, and there's this reclaiming, right, of African birthing approaches and epistemologies, but also that just seems to think that it's the women who have been doing this. But what I'm finding is what happened over time, and I'm just going to go through because this is a lot. What happened over time was the colonial interrupters came to African countries and sort of brought in the idea of gendered roles, what men should do and what women should do, and sort of created some kind of job that would appeal to the men, move them into that, and women were left okay, you could still be traditional birth attendants or traditional midwives. And then over time, they were also marginalized. And before we knew it, there was just this hypocritical process of displacing the men, right? Making it seem like it's just women's work. And at the end of the day, discrediting the women also as risky and not able to help with the women, or just do not have skills, right, to, deliver babies. And now we have the Western medical man in terms of the OBGYN now becoming the expert in this field. So we are seeing all of this marginalization and colonial interruption, which continues to manifest in even the way that globalized maternal strategies will refer to, traditional birth attendants with all the baggage that comes with that labeling. But on the other hand, we'll call medical personnel skilled birth attendants, which is another thing that I am questioning. Right. And I'm going to go for a few minutes over what I heard from the women midwives on the ground, the mama babies, and the birthers, the women who use their birthing and pregnancy services, and then the men midwives themselves, the baba babies. And so for the women midwife, when I asked them, they're like, oh, we work with men, right? In fact, it came from them before I started asking more questions. And then they were like, okay, we work with men. There's no discrimination. We don't see the difference, except that 10% of them will say, oh, well, we think they're more business-like, because for we women, we're just wanting to help one another. If pregnant women don't have money, we will just still attend to them. But we think that for the men, it's more like you have to come in with your money and then it's structured. And so they're like, okay, maybe for them, it's more about the money. And again, that was just 10% of the women who were really like, this critical about thinking about a gendered relation. And then some of them will say, oh, okay, when I ask them, do women just go to try men midwives, or do they prefer to come to you? Like, oh, well, women just go, to either, right? And they told me that women really don't think about these things. But I would ask the women too, and they actually corroborated that. But one thing that also came up is the fact that some sect of Islamic religion, the Tabligh, from what they told me, is the one that actually interacts with women, some women's cultural religious belief, right? And I'm saying cultural religious because I assume to just be cultural, but it's actually that religious interaction with their culture that makes them say, well, we can't go to men midwives, we can go to male doctors, right? So that's a thing that I found out from all of the people that I spoke with. But overall, I think what is more important is that the women midwives also know that, that there are men in this world. We work with men. Some of them are training their sons. Some of them have been trained by their fathers, like I mentioned earlier. And they also know that births just flow around without discriminating, whether the birth attendants or the midwives are male or female, right? And the birthers themselves also corroborated all the things that I said, but also noted that some women would not go if they belong to this Islamic sect. So I'm finding that some things that is assumed in globalized maternal health frameworks, like, well, some African women would not want men to attend to their birth because of cultural and all of that. From my finding, it is more of that sect. I'm not sure if I can say fundamentalist, right? But that would be my own interpretation, not theirs, right? Islamic sect that is really interacting with women who are not wanting to see men midwife. But from just like the plainly cultural, historical concept and what is happening contemporarily, for most birthers, they would not just discriminate against men, and it doesn't matter to them. For them, for the men, I think what I found that is most powerful is that for them, this is a matter of life and death. In fact, when I asked them, this question is like, what are you even asking? And one of them said, what do you think this is actually? This is a matter of life and death. And at that point, the woman is not worried about nudity or any other thing that you're thinking about. She's thinking about how she will be alive and the baby will be alive, and that's what matters. So he says that at that point it is war to save. That's what he described it. He said it is war. Oguni lati gba emi la, I mean, yeah, more like this is serious business, and no one thinks about gender in that scope, right? So, and I thought that was like really powerful. But I must also say that the younger men midwives that I met were like, well, now it seems like we should be doing something that is more masculine, more, male gender work, especially if they're young and if they have Western education. Now they're thinking about, should we keep modernizing these or should we change their name? It's more like this gender construction, right? The colonial construction is more like impacting more on men midwives, depending on their age, their Western education, and the more they align with what is this women's work or men's work. So that in itself has that impact. But as I know that impact is not natural, as I'll explain in my discussion of what I'm thinking. So my reflection, there's a lot that I'm reflecting on, and I'll just speak about a few. And one is that the men, as the women, some women betters actually said, more of the men that I met were more like, really like, okay, it's business-like, it's more structured, and they are more into the traditional birth attendant organizations and associations. They are more in alliance with the government. So I also saw that, and that made me wonder, right, how we can interpret this contemporary gendered interaction, right? The women who are doing this just like, being pushed to the line because gender is playing a role, and the men taking the, more forefront, right? But from my understanding, I think I also saw that. And I also saw like the fact that for the elderly ones who do not have Western education, most of these things do not matter. But I see also that Western education, which of course comes with all these benefits, but also some colonial baggages as well, right? So that is also like, okay, what should we call it? Should we structure this? Or we want to be more like, more medicalized, more aligned to the, but that's not necessarily like a bad thing. It's just like to think about the contemporary, the continuous impact of colonial gendering, and then colonial language, colonial structures around childbirth in general. So one of the things that, I mean, I talked about all of the assumptions, and I'm just going to skip this slide so that I don't repeat it. Ray of hope, and before I talk about ray of hope, there's that, fear of like, will this go into extinction for the elderly ones? They're like, oh, we're still training our sons, we still find someone interested. For like half of them, some of their sons who have Western education would rather do, some white collar job. So there's that fear that like, are we going to be able to pass this on? And I think the fear is more on for the men, for younger men to be able to step into this. One of them that I met, who is like 30 years old, said he's been trained by his dad over time, and he left. He went to school, he went to Polytechnic. He didn't want to do this job, but everything for him, it's a spiritual calling. That was the only reason he came back to it, because he said, well, everything I've done hasn't been successful, and according to my destiny, this is my job, so I needed to come back into it. But other than that, I was like, well, maybe I should be doing something that my mates would not say, what are you doing? Because I have education. And then he also talked more about the sort of like ways that he saw younger men, women not wanting to come to him as a younger male baby. And I'm beginning to wonder what is going to happen as we transition into younger generations who are educated, who are young. Are we still able to carry this on and have men participate in this communal, participatory, and gender-neutral work, which is what I'm finding it to be. But that said, I found a lot of resistance. Like, this is something we need to do, and this connects to broad African traditional medicine, right? And people are like, okay, this is still part of it. And men are still in this world. And some women are still training their sons as well. And it is fascinating that one of the participants in Ibadan actually was like, okay, I'm training my son, he's in school, but he also knows that he has to combine these two things. So he's very good with this, he's born into it, he's skilled, and I know he's going to carry it on when he becomes, a medical personnel. So that is interesting to see how this evolves, right? And we can continue to problematize this further. So they're navigating in interesting ways, see part of the narrative, and we need to search lights on them, and they're actually trying to make this survive, right? I was just going to show you some pictures that I found, and we have to really deconstruct the assumption around gender roles on maternal health. Creating colonial language, and then to know the impact of colonial religion and how it interacts, and then oftentimes the religion is considered cultural, right? And then to also think about the colonial medical structures, right? And that I would just like to say a little bit about that. So when I asked the women, so do you see any difference between if it's a male traditional midwife or going to the OBGYN? I think it actually evolved from them. And they were like, I would rather see a man traditional midwife because I feel safe and secure. But in the open world, I don't think I'm so comfortable with just being open and all the men will come to do vaginal examination where they're trying to measure how much I've dilated. So some of them, think about that structure as something that makes them think about gender of the birth attendants. So that was something that I also really thought about. So it's different for them when they're in with this strange man who they do not know, who perhaps do not even speak their language, and they do not know what he's doing, and he's always coming to check. Another one is coming to check. So in some ways, that for them is something, and just being in that word. So we can think about how that colonial interruption of moving birth space to the hospital, away from the community, away from the home, away from where the Baba baby and his wife and his children and the Mama baby and her husband and everyone is part of the process, to a space where it seems like there's a whole lot of foreign dynamics that women could also put into consideration. How to decolonize, interrogate colonial interruption, right? Think about the male Agbebis is something important for me. But for me, decolonization is not about thinking about going to the past to see what it has been, but to put into a historical context, but also think about what is happening now and see what we can really learn, to critique the continuous colonial interruptions, because it's continuing. When we think about the education, the medical system, there are a lot of ways that these things are still in place. So colonization is not like it's not over, right? So we can constantly think about what Nouveau Gachene will call coloniality, right? And then we can continue to reclaim and resist and redirect the usefulness of African birthing work for practical goods of maternal health, improving maternal health, and see how they can contribute to helping improve maternal and infant outcome as well. Thank you so much. I'm grateful. Okay, see if I can stop sharing my screen. Okay, thank you. I'm not sure how I did with time, but I think I tried my best. So thank you everyone for listening to me. And now we are going to have Chineye Anikwe. I'm not sure that I've seen her. Okay, so we just would have to skip it that way. So we're going to be going to Miss Fadeyi. Miss Fadeyi, just give me a moment. I know you sent me your bio and I'm trying to read it. A lot has happened today. Okay, I'm just gonna say Miss Tolulope Esther Fadeyi is from, okay, I lost my slide. Okay, he's from the University of Basel, and she's going to be talking to us about beyond politics and culture, decolonizing midwifery practices in Yoruba land. So I will please indulge you to say a few sentences of your bio before I can pull it up again. Thank you. You are muted.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm Tolulope Esther from University of Basel, Switzerland. My research focuses on the maternal health in British Colonial, that is in Yoruba land, where I was born and where I grew up. So I think my interaction with aged people, in particular healers, has broadened my understanding of what constitutes maternal health. And for this presentation, I tried to deviate a bit and look at it from the cultural aspects of what constitutes male hegemony in midwifery practices. So once again, I would like to say a big thank you to Lagos Study Association and to organizer of this panel for the opportunity for me to present and at least to help female voices in another dimension. So today I try to look at beyond politics and culture, decolonizing midwifery practices in Yoruba land. And from this picture, it is clear that we have like two sides of the coin. Although I tried to look for an African perspective that depict this, unfortunately, I couldn't get one. So I got this from Alinsin Nexin, who wrote on the men and women in midwifery. And she tried to illustrate the need for gender equality in a midwifery institution. I also tried to go through the memory lane from the historical perspective and to see what constitutes midwifery practices within the global studies. And again, I was able to stumble upon Alison Nexin article on men and women in midwifery. And then in her work, she argued that as at early 1522, the tide of midwifery practices in European community shifted its focus from what used to be a female health to a male occupation. She was of the view that Dr. Welt of Hamburg, in order to have experiences of what reproduction is, he had to disguise and dress like a female in order to learn the act of childbirth. Unfortunately, he was caught and he was burned alive. That was in 1522. And later in the mid-16th century, the renowned surgeon known as Pearl, he was a major figure that laid the foundation for male midwifery. And he needed male to experience what he referred to as reproductive experiences rather. And by doing so, he was able to pull out babies from the womb and by their feet during difficult births. Nelson was able to establish that Louis XIV was able to employ male midwives in order to deliver his illegitimate children. An interesting aspect of Nelson, which I found so fascinating, was that Nelson was able to establish the need for male hegemony in midwifery practices. Away from Nelson perspective, I argue that the cultural understanding of what constitutes birth was a major argument in which Nelson did not put to the fore, and which I'm going to do at the moment. I also argue that why Nelson argued that men in European community were able to go to schools, they were able to acquire knowledge on on medical tools that is used during childbirth. I also argue that we have a set of men in Yoruba land, otherwise known as Esikiawo. This set of herbalists specializes on reproduction, especially on childbirth. So I was able to share the same perspective with him by advocating for male hegemony in midwifery practices. But I argue that the cultural framing of the reproductive bodies, female bodies, is missing in our own contribution. So yeah, I try to, during the course of my interaction with female professional birth attendants, I was able to establish one who is about 130 years old. I still need to show her during the course of my slide presentation. And we have here Iya Abiye, Iyalode Oloshu of Ibadan. The term Iya Abiye, I'm sure, is a common term that is used to identify female midwives. And I also try to why is it that we don't have Baba Abiye? So that is one of my major arguments. Then I try to situate male hegemony in midwifery practices. Then I try to look at the specific theories that try to establish this. Then, according to Colonial in 1987, was of the opinion that theories don't grow on trees. So terrorizing is itself a social practice with a politics. So what politics are underlying male hegemony midwifery practice? So I'm going to unravel this as I try to go through the lane of Yoruba land. Then I also try to look at feminist gender theories that focuses on the need to identify with women and the likes. So among which the proponents so far include Colonel RW and even our home professor Oyewumi Oyerunke. And this set of people, they've been able to, tell us more about the need to influence the conceptual framing of the subject matter. And then they have been able to look at it from various aspects. But I try to look at it and my thoughts resonate with what constitutes the place of masculinity theory from what Yamo and Komoro had said in this delight. So I argue that the place of masculinity theory in midwifery roles has to do with the fact that women beings, we are active in the construction of masculinity. So however, this happens in an environment that is made up of different individuals, like we have witches, ancestral spirits, and then other malevolent powers that exist in that environment. So I was able to argue that although there have been theories of masculinity that must include the cultural reality of what I have said so far, and that there must be, there is a need to socially, to put into consideration spirituality when trying to socially construct what gender roles are in female midwifery practices. So I also try to look at the state of knowledge, and I try to understand from that there have been various studies that focus on the physiological dissimilarities of female bodies. Most times, what studies have reviewed have been the biological characteristics of female bodies, and then they try to okay, there is need to engender maternal body. By this, they try to limit male participation in the midwifery practices. And I also argued that there have been various responses to female hegemony in African midwifery institution. For instance, there have been various IFA couples on what constitutes female hegemony, and most of the arguments have been more buttressed by Oshun. And for instance, there has been assumption that okay, the fact that Oshun and Yemoja are fertility goddess, so anyone in particular, the kind of gender that must take care of women must definitely be women. But I try to argue that this must not be so. Why? Because women, we are life givers, we are life savers. Indeed, we don't deserve to die in an attempt to give another life. I also argue that the cultural construction of what constitutes pregnancy, motherhood, and reproduction transcend an understanding of Western perspective. So by so doing, there is need to involve the male Babalawo, the Ezekiels in the birthing system. Why? Because they have knowledge of divination, and they have the writing. And from my various interactions, I was able to establish that most of the women that venture into the midwifery practices, they now try to learn the art of herbalism. So this is a major argument of Ayodeji Ogunaike in his attempt to talk about what constitutes Babalawo and the Iyanifa, which I'm still going to talk about. So for the gap in literature, I argue that most of the literature, they've negated the salient and invaluable roles of Ezekiel in engendering maternal health. I hope time is still on my side. So I also try to look why the need for us to establish, to decolonize midwifery practices. And it is worthy of note to mention that during the course of my presentation, I argue that colonialism in one way or the other did not negate the role of the Ezekiel in contemporary time. Why? Because from what I've read and from the propositions of Nelson, in which she was able to advocate the need for male midwifery practices. So my thoughts also resonate with this. So I argue that midwifery is a mystery. Being a mystery, the state of pregnancy rather, then there is need to ensure a collective effort when engendering maternal health. There's a particular Yoruba proverb that goes thus, ojú kan ló ń bímọ, igba ojú ló ń wò, which goes thus that the act of caring for children or engendering pregnancy is a collective activity. So being a collective activity, then I do not see any need for midwifery practices to now be dominated by we women. It is high time we try to give men opportunity even to be present during childbirth. So, and then why I argue that herbalism is primarily identified with men. I was able to gather this while I traveled to Ibadan and also to Oshun. Most of the women that are engaging in herbalism, many of them is either they've already exceeded the age of menopause and they must have been initiated into the court. Most of the traditional birth attendants that I was opportunity to interview, many of them just had knowledge of the various herbs and plants that can be used for a specific medical condition. But when such pregnancy or maybe some certain conditions are being occasioned by malevolent power, then many of them try to go back to the Ezekiel. So I argue that it is high time to look at integrating, like a formal integration of both the Ezekiel and the traditional birth attendant. And I argue that the Ezekiel, they possess powers and the ability to negotiate with malevolent powers, unlike what is being obtained that in a contemporary time. So from here, I try to raise like a paradox, try to see this is an image of Oshun, who is identified as Olomowewe, mother of great children. Then I also try to look at an Ezekiel, who his name is Baba Fayemi. He's also a notable herbalist in Songo area of Ibadan. And he also specializes on reproductive health. So I try to create the paradox, knowing well that we know Oshun to be mother of great children, fertility goddess. Then there is need to still rely on men that focuses on reproductive health. So I'll try to look at that in this particular session. First, I was able to establish that any attempt to decolonize midwifery practices must take into consideration the need for cultural impetus. I've already established this earlier, that the state of pregnancy and engendering maternal health it goes beyond the Western clinical practices, but is a mystery. So being a mystery, being that way, there is need to offer sacrifices in some cases, then there is need to integrate the men into this. Then I argued that colonialism in Yoruba space did not in any way negate the role of men in engendering maternal health. A memory down, we see various interactions of Western doctors with herbalists. Their first point of contact with the set of herbalists are male, not even female. So the reason being that they know that these people have knowledge of traditional medicine and the likes. So I also argue that and midwifery practices in Yoruba land, and that being that knowledge is power, this set of people, they know what they do, they know better than the men, than the women, and then in most cases, they are not willing to absorb them into the various courts. Then there is need for more men to be well absorbed into the midwifery practices. And it is very important to note that my presentation focuses on the traditional role of herbalists, unlike the contemporary Western midwives that we now have in our various community. Then I also try to look at the tension between the gendered institution of what constitutes Iyanifa and Babalawo. So I try to place this on a balance of Oshun and Eshu. In Yoruba cosmology, it is generally believed that for a sacrifice to be accepted by Olodumare, such a sacrifice must go through Eshu. So whether you are a worshipper of Oshun or Batala, Shango, many of the herbalists that I encountered, they try to also have a place where they worship Eshu. They try to like appease Eshu in order to engender maternal health. So for the sake of time, these are my reflections. So I argue that colonialism does not pay considerable attention to the potential of African traditional medicine. African traditional medicine as a cultural heritage. Reason being that traditional medicine itself transcends the notion of color and continent. Rather, it emphasizes the need for holistic healing. So if one can take into consideration the fact that pregnancy and reproduction transcend Western practices, then there is need to focus more on men hegemony rather in midwifery practices. So I argue that the domain of global health, healing, and culture, they are intimately entwined and they are inseparable. this has been the most argument of most anthropologists, and they've argued that the health of women the health of the people rather is inseparable from their culture. I also established that since the outcome of maternal mortality is devastating, especially in Nigeria, then there is need for us to decolonize midwifery practices in order to accelerate maternal health, even in the 21st century. I also argue that the decolonizing agenda to reconfigure midwifery practices will improve maternal health outcome. There is a need to give space to men. There's the need to give space to include men in midwifery practices. By so doing, it's going to reduce the rate of maternal mortality. And I argue that decolonizing midwifery practices in Yoruba land must be gender balanced. It must be gender balanced, irrespective of what of a particular hegemony or female. It is high time we now encourage more men to go to specialize more on reproductive health. So because most of my interaction with men, if you go through my slide, I was opportune to meet just one who was willing for to talk more on it. Many of them are now trying to focus more on other part of reproductive other part of diseases unlike reproductive health. Then finally, I argue that colonialism aided male hegemony in Yoruba midwifery practices. So in as much that colonialism did not displace the herbalists in contributing to reproductive health, then I think it's high time we come together and try to see the importance of the SKROs in fostering maternal health. Thank you very much. Eshe Pupo. I await your suggestion and question. Thank you.
You are muted. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. I apologize for that. Thank you, Ms. Olokwe Stafade. I'm going to skip all the things that I said. I was just saying thank you. All right. So now we're going to have the next speaker, which is Ms. Damilola Fagite. Did I say that correctly? Okay. And Ms. Damilola is from the Obafemi Awolowo University and is a faculty member at the Department of History, Obafemi Awolowo University, where she's also a doctoral student. Her research interests include infant and maternal welfare services, history of women's reproductive health, and social history of health and healing. So thank you so much, Ms. Damilola. We're going to listen to your presentation now. And you have like 12 minutes, so we can have enough time for question and answer. So take it up.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for and I want to thank everyone for creating this platform. Thank you. All right, I will be presenting on women's midwifery and in this paper, I try to focus on the attempts by the British colonial government in Lagos to control women's intro, Western, and infant and maternal welfare. It is important to note that the 1920s high mortality rate of both babies and mothers, especially during childhood. This actually became a major concern for the colonial government, and because it passed through the 1930s, the fear was that it would have a drastic effect on the economic productivity of the colonial state. So, as a result, the colonial government was forced to effort to maternal mortality, to reduce mortality rate actually resulted in what we call state-run initiatives. You can't hear me. Okay. Sorry. Let me just. We are what? Okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? All right, beautiful. So I can go ahead. All right, so I was saying that efforts to reduce mortality rates resulted in state-run initiatives, and several measures were put in place to reduce maternal and infant mortality rates. And some of these measures were to, consciously take mothers through maternal education. Then the colonial government also introduced antenatal care. Then also there was this medicalization of childbirth, and then midwifery services and education also went through certain reforms. So this shift resulted in profound changes to the experience of childbirth and then to the role of the states in the area of social welfare. So it is against this backdrop that my paper explores how the colonial government played politics with women's reproduction behavior by transforming midwifery practice and instituting maternal and infant welfare service. So, and some of the questions this one of the questions this paper intends to answer is to look at the state of infant and maternal mortality before the colonial government stepped in. And of course, there were some factors as highlighted by the colonial government that contributed to high maternal and infant mortality rates. And some of these factors include, but not limited to, native midwives and the unskilled interference during child deliveries, which caused mothers to suffer obstructed labor. Then another factor was ineffective and faulty motherhood skills. Then we have poor housing, poor nutrition, and then some other numerous factors. So, like I mentioned earlier, that certain measures were put in place by the colonial government. And one of those measures, like I mentioned earlier, was conscious adopted by the colonial authorities as a means to purge Lagos mothers of maternal ignorance and to also re-engineer a new motherhood, which was fashioned on the colonizers' ideas. So it's that Nigerian mothers had constantly exposed their infants to disease out of ignorance. Therefore, maternal education was seen as the most appropriate tool to rectify the situation. So mothers must be educated on their responsibility to maintain personal hygiene and controlling field in their domestic space. Also, as part of maternal education and as part of measures put in place to control infant and maternal mortality rates was also the introduction of the Health Week. So the Health Week was introduced, and as part of the Health Week, we have the baby show, which was organized by the Lagos Town Council. So the baby show was actually initiated, and of course, it later became popular among mothers in Lagos during the colonial period. So when the first baby show premiered, winners were selected with several rewards, and mothers began to see the benefits of publicly showing their babies, publicly display of their elder babies. So the baby show featured children from birth to about age 5, and the eligibility for this baby show was based on the mother's attendance at
antenatal clinics before delivery. So the idea of the baby show was actually to determine the eldest baby. So Health Week and baby shows became a regular event in Lagos during the colonial period. And by 1935 and 1939, Lagos won the first prize in the Imperial Baby Challenge Shoot competition. So baby shows then became a tool adopted to regulate women's reproductive behavior. So in other words, Lagos mothers were gently urged to accept colonial conception of effective motherhood and then to change their maternal behaviors through a system that's publicly praised mothers who had entered the colonial terrain with medals and photographs, and then punished mothers who, refused the maternal reconstruction by denying them access to the baby shows. Then also, welfare services were introduced, that is maternal and infant welfare services. So majority of the maternal and infant welfare efforts in Nigeria were concentrated around Lagos. And welfare services were centered around the provision of antenatal care to expectant mothers, and then also postnatal care to infants. Then also there were regular clinic visits, weighing clinics where mothers were, encouraged to bring their infants on monthly basis in order to assess and monitor the child's development. And of course, in 1937 alone, at the Mrs. Street Dispensary, about 198 infants welfare clinics were held, and it was recorded that about 3,697 infants were examined. And of course, in that year alone, about 41,836 health visits were made. Also, there was also instructional sessions in infant care skills, that is in terms of nutrition, diet, infant clothing, treatment of common diseases in babies and all of that, and then especially care for the umbilical cord. So of course, in 1925, work began on the renovation of the Lagos Mrs. Street Dispensary. And the idea of this was actually to create facility, which was designed with special provision for maternity for women's and children's diseases. So in the first 2 months of its operation, about 3 maternity cases were admitted, and more than 4,000 outpatient cases were treated at the clinic. So maternal and infant welfare services continue to develop through the interwar years. And of course, clinics provided key services to the community, including regular visits by the nurses and trained health visitors to new mothers. Then there was also maternity care, infant health clinics in terms of immunizations. Then antenatal and child care advice was also combined with general public health education through posters, leaflets, and other means. So with this, infant mortality rates in Lagos reduced from a recorded 96.3% per 1,000 live births in 1919 to about 134 in 1929, and then 127 in 1939, and 104 by 1949. So we can see the reduction and how effective these were. And then these were attributed to the success of the maternal and infant welfare services and midwives in bringing health and advice to mothers. Then for figures of maternal mortality, it was more complex, and it was complex because it was characterized by fluctuations rather than a steady decline in the figure. So there was only a slight decrease from about 8.9 per thousand in 1934 to 7.7 by 1952. So I will just conclude by saying that the services of maternal and infant, I'll just conclude by saying that the maternal and infant welfare services introduced in colonial Lagos between 1945 and 19 1945, out of effort, reduction of infant and maternal mortality rates. So I'll stop here. I welcome questions, suggestions on this topic that can improve the quality of the work. Thank you, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Damila Fatige, for taking us through that colonial understanding of what happened in Lagos during the colonial period in terms of the introduction of the Western colonial maternal health strategies. I'm sure we'll come to questions to really understand if we know what it was before 1925, and actually so that we can put what actually happened between 1925 and 45 in better context. And I think I like how, everyone is kind of like connecting, and the fact that Tolulope and I were really thinking about male participation, and then talked about the colonial interruption, but also argued that this needs to be communal. It is communal actually in the ways that it's practiced, but we actually cannot overlook the continuous colonial interruption, right? So how is it that some and perhaps wanting to move away from reproductive health, what is in that? And why is it that when it looks like younger men in Lagos are like, okay, do I really want to do this? How can we put all of these in conversation? So it's all connecting in that way, and would like to now hear from our next speaker, Ms. Ellen Uga, who is going to be talking to us about, I was glad I had gotten rid of it, the dialectical tension. And I think I'm really fascinated by this topic, and we'll see how this comes in sync with our conversation for today. So if we can take about, say, 10 minutes so that we can have the remaining 15 minutes for question and answer, that will be great. Thank you. And you can go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. Should I say, unfortunately, I don't think my work is in sync with yours, because you worked on midwifery. I think my work is at least.
I know there are always connections. We'll pull it out. So we're all talking about maternal health, and it will come together. Trust me.
Okay, let me see if I can play the audio recording I have for about a minute.
My abortion story. It's really a tough one. Or should I say it was a tough one? Yeah, I announced my first child, had my first baby. About 2 years after I had my second, we thought about
Well,
it.
since we don't have time, let me just go straight to my presentation. Now, of course, abortion is most often the end result of unplanned pregnancy. And unplanned pregnancy is noted to be the bane of women of reproductive age. And by extension, it is a global concern. More than half of unplanned pregnancy most often end in abortion. However, I would say that abortion is a major strategy for managing unwanted and unplanned pregnancy, both within and outside marriage. Now, in the discourse of abortion, many things come into play. There's gender, there's medicine, there's religion, there's rights, regulation, as well as morality. So to speak, we also say that abortion causes women pain, it causes them distress, worry, as well as psychological stress. And it has also been noted to be one of the major causes of maternal morbidity and mortality in many African countries, maybe as a result of the stringent abortion policies in many of these countries. For instance, in Nigeria, in cases of rape, or when the fetus poses a threat to the life of the mother. As a result of this, most abortion services in Nigeria is clandestine, in the sense that it is procured legally and then most often carried out by quacks. As a result of this, there's usually no post-abortion care services, except where the abortion results in post-abortion complication. It is when it happens like that people go to hospitals, and in major cases, such post-abortion complication ends in either the loss of the womb of the woman, or it's actually or some other complications. So as a result of the illegality associated with abortion in Nigeria, and also the Nigerian belief about the sanctity of human life, that is the pro-life ideology, abortion is a highly sensitive and taboo topic in Nigeria. Now, because abortion is a taboo topic, women are usually reluctant to talk about their abortion experiences. So we'll say that narrative about abortion is stigmatized and marginalized in many Nigerian societies. The discourse of abortion is replete with shame and secrecy. Most women do not want to own up to having taken a human life, okay, according to the pro-choice, pro-life ideology. However, I would still say that scholarship on societal perception of abortion have revealed common themes, such as the centric depiction of abortion, cultural meanings of abortion, societal attitude towards abortion, and the rest of all that. One notable theme in all this literature is that whether it's pro-life or pro-choice, one is still slightly, to some extent, frowned upon in many societies in the world, and in Nigeria it is totally frowned upon and a huge taboo. Now, narratives about abortion from, of course, women's perspective, okay, contains a lot of nuances. For instance, most abortion stories reflect dialectical tensions. Dialectical tensions are the salient or ambivalent or opposing themes that appears in people's emotions and classification of their experiences. And dialectical choices or tension investigates the interplay of conflicting ideas, which these ideas can be regarded as binary opposites in most cases. And because investigating dialectical choices in women's personal abortion narrative, I use the relational dialectic theory to account for the conflicting emotional perspective in women who had abortion, in the personal abortion narrative of such women. Now, in abortion narrative, women authenticate their perception of it. So some of them defending their choice or talking about how the abortion experiences made them feel. So an investigation of abortion narrative extends knowledge about women's abortion experiences and also argues that the linguistic resources utilized by these women to talk about their experiences shows the effects of abortion on them. Now, the data for this study is got from women's personal narrative. I actually got the data on WhatsApp. I shared on my WhatsApp status asking women who had abortion to share their story, that is, if they are comfortable about sharing it. So I got about 40 respondents, which I use in my data. And generally, I would say that women's personal abortion stories are sites for internal struggles and tensions. Okay, most of these struggles and tensions stems from the extent to which Nigerian women or these women have internalized the abortion stigma in the Nigerian society. The stories also reflect gender norms and power imbalances replete in our society. Now, the dialectical tension, like I said, is are more or less binary opposites. So in some of the stories, you find where the women try to defend their abortion choices and decisions by giving different reasons why they did abortion. So one of them is avoiding stigma versus living with guilt. So in order to avoid the stigmatization of abortion and the stigmatization associated with unplanned pregnancy, especially for men and women who have so many children already or have little kids, such that there's no spacing between the baby at hand and the one in the womb. The abortion is most often the best choice for them. So in order to avoid the stigmatization of having an unwanted pregnancy or having another baby, after, just shortly after having a baby, most women opt for abortion. In relation to that, also, sorry, I didn't title this, but this is more or less like the tendency to share abortion experiences or to open up about having done abortion. So for the single women, of course, do not want to find it difficult to talk about the abortion experiences because they do not want to be castigated by the society. So for the young girls living with their parents or living with guardians who will castigate their choices, they rather live with the pain of the abortion processes, whether the abortion indicated or surgical. They rather live with the pain than open up about their abortion experiences. But for some of the married women, they are sometimes comfortable about talking about the abortion experiences with their spouse, but outside that, they do not want to share their experiences. Also evidence in the data is the imperative of good or bad motherhood. Now, some married women opt for abortion because they've either had too many children that they can cater for, or because the baby at hand is too young to have a younger sibling. So if they get pregnant while tendering to a young baby, the young baby would suffer and will make them feel guilty. So while they are trying to be good mothers by giving birth to the fetus in the womb, they will be portrayed as a bad mother to the baby at hand. But if they decide to go for abortion, they will still be portrayed as bad for aborting the fetus while trying to be a good mother for the baby at hand. So either way, the imperative of good or bad motherhood also feature in many women's abortion stories. Related to that is, of course, choice. The portrayal of abortion as an only choice or amidst or a choice amidst other choices. So women sometimes have to consider their career, whether to pursue their career or live with the guilt, okay, of having had an abortion. But however it is, choice is a major theme that is reflected in women's personal abortion narrative. In conclusion, I would like to say that the Nigerian societal stigma about abortion and the Nigerian pro-life ideology contributes to women's decision to have abortion. Extensively, I would say that this has negative effects on Nigerian women because, like I said earlier on, most often than not, in order to hide or prevent the stigmatization of having an unplanned pregnancy, they have to consists of quack, which in most cases do not end well. However, I will say that their choices or reason for procuring abortion notwithstanding, abortion causes women pain and psychological distress. Majority, about should I say 70% of my respondents recorded, owned up to recording several months of depression as a result of having had that. Of course, the lack of abortion services, okay, impedes women's mental health after having had an abortion. Since abortion is legal in Nigeria to a large extent, women do not get counseling before and after the abortion procedure, which most often affects their mental health. So, and then I will also say that these are to a large extent impeded Nigerian women's reproductive justice. So I would say that based on the Nigerian social and religious ideals about abortion, Nigerian women's reproductive justice is limited. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. If you can please share your slide, your screen. Right. Thank you. And thank you all to all the speakers. Thank you to everyone who was listening first. We're now question and answer. We have 15 minutes. I have checked and I found questions online. So one question for Esther and Tolu, and someone says they want to know how widespread male midwives are where in colonial period. Was this normative all parts Yoruba, right? And our questions are because they're quite similar. And also for Esther and Tolu from same person. Tolu, you mentioned that males in midwifery practice in colonial Yoruba land, and Esther's position is the how be reconciled. So Tolu, I would like you to say also, and then you might think about the same. Because I said that, and I was going to really make us bring it together. See us like, you know, seemingly saying same things, right? Because I was making the connection, but it was sounding like it was different. But that was my own view, and we'll get to that. So can you like answer the question? So how prevalent do you think, you know, the Kiawo, you know, in Yoruba land, and was this widespread, and how prevalent was? And I can talk about contemporary times.
Thank you, Alice, for the so I go with the first one. From my with ELAs, I was able to establish male midwives in during the colonial period. But this set of people are just like the normal hands that we have. But most of them, they began to male midwifery at towards like the 1930s out when although from colonial record we have female dominance indeed. For instance, we have the a notable woman in that was empowered by Yemeja, and it's worthy of note that she was able to give so many children to women. And I also I pointed to the case of Shun and Yemeja as fertility goddess, and these goddesses also try to they are very prominent in that they not just fertility goddess, they also engage to take care of the children. Then the second one, I met that colonialism did not in any way negate male midwifery by saying that I tried to establish the very fact that although there was conflict of interest between healers and the Western doctors, but this does not in any way negate the role of healers. First, in 1920, when the company was introduced by the government, is not in any way to like set them apart. No, before the arrival of colonialism or the British in Yoruba land, we already have an existing indigenous care. So the British knew that they cannot do without them. So what they tried to do is to introduce the company ordinance in 1922 just to regulate the activities of the Tui and other form of local belief in this regard. So by saying that I did not negate it, that does not mean that there was no conflict of interest. What I just tried to say is that both the healer and the try to reach in an attempt to internal health. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tolulokwe. Right. So I will just say briefly about the first question that about finding in contact Babag babies, the traditional birth attendants who are men, right? They've had this most of them, right? A few of them like got trained, right, from other traditional birth attendants, but most of them would say, my father, my grandfather, this is what we have been doing in my community. So that for me shows that this is something that, you know, seems to like really commonplace, right? And then for us to still like be finding a whole lot of them means that it's something that's been there over time, right? Either as Sololokwe would say, they were existing as Eskiawo or as Abalis who were helping with childbirth. But this, you know, it largely connects with how communal this has been. and that it hasn't been gendered, right, the way it has been now from historical perspective. And I still see that a lot in contemporary times. I'm seeing a whole lot of like male traditional birth attendants and in Lagos, in Ibadan, and I've had like a photojournalist like send me pictures of the ones he has taken pictures of in Abeokuta just recently. So this is saying that they've been there and they are still there, right? And then let's connect that to the colonial interruption, right? So I hear what Ulokwe was saying, and I was wondering about the word negate itself, but I also hear how she was saying, you know, there were all of these disruptions, right? And now where even though we still have them, they're practicing, which is part of the work for me to highlight that they've been there and they're still there. So it means that they're not like totally like eradicated or displaced, but we can see a whole lot of like tussle, navigation, resistance, sometimes like attempt to integrate, and sometimes a false attempt to integrate. Because I'm also finding this very double discourse, right? Where they say, oh, come, let us train you, traditional birth attendants. Let's show you how to do things, what to do when a pregnancy seems to be complicated, or there's a case emergency, we need you to refer. And then the referral process isn't working because when the women are referred, especially Lagos State, to public hospital, Lagos State hospitals, they're like, oh, you've been to Agbebi, you've been to Alagbo, we can't take you in. So there's that disconnect. Despite the promise of we're trying to work with you and we're trying to train you. And part of the disruption for me also is what that training, because I have been part of that training. So while I was working with the medical units of the US consulates in Lagos, we would go to communities to train traditional birth attendants. And most of them were male, interestingly. And we would like just train them to say, this is how to use this basic surgical equipment. When you find any complication, refer them to Island Maternity, right? But we see that the process wasn't working well. And part of the flaw of the process of training them for me also is that it was coming from this expertise authoritative approach. Like, this is the Western medical is the authority. That's what the expert is in birthing services, and we're just training you to adopt this approach. So for me, that is some disruption that is ongoing, right? And one can continue to, problematize what that is doing to how it still exists. And I think that also connects with Damilola's exposition on what happened between 1925 and 1945. And I find it interesting that there's also Van Tol who wrote about babies and mother in colonial states in Lagos, Nigeria between 1925 and 45. There was a lot of disruption there. There was a lot of manipulation of data because before then, the numbers were not being recorded. So they would come and just record numbers and say, here. And then Van Tol would also say there were a lot of things missing. And there were a lot of ways that they were not really talking about what they met on ground because they were trying to displace it and replace it with this new, modern, Western approach of childbirthing. So for me, there's been that disruption and it continues to manifest in varying ways, even as the Agbebis, male, female, however they identify, continues to resist and continue to do their work, and we still find men midwives, all over. And this is just like really fascinating that we're bringing them into the narrative, because if there was not that disruption, perhaps we would all know about them and be part of the conversation, and we would not think about midwife as just restricted to men attending women's births, which is the way that is being approached mostly from globalized maternal perspective. So. Bump out of our Zoom. Is there a question? Damilola, is there a question in the room? Oh, there's one. There's one from Folarami Florishaluan Olorunibe. Sorry, this is what I got. In the colonizing colonial medical midwifery practices in sync with the concept of modernity, how do we position the scheme for the training of Africans as midwives, as well as incorporating of the Iyabiye to the colonial medical services from the 1940s in Yoruba colonies, as opposed to the integration of male midwives in contemporary times? Right. So I would really like to know I think I talked a lot about that when I was talking about, what the training is doing and how there's this ways that we can think about what is happening in contemporary times, the integration of male midwives, the traditional midwives, the ones that I found in Lagos. And I'm saying Lagos in particular because it just seems to be a little bit different from Abeokuta and Ibadan, because it has Oyo and Osun State. For Lagos State, there's that intention to train traditional birth attendants, right? And that in a way is giving more space to the men, right, who are now like, wants to be known as traditional birth attendants. Even though they are adopting these traditional approaches, they are now incorporating a whole lot of that modern birthing approaches. And like I said, I'm not describing that as either good or bad, but it is something that we can continue to think further, like what function is this modernity doing, right? And what is this integration about, right? Does it, for me, I think I see for one that, and we're going to stop in a minute, I see for one that they are able to use some of these modern frameworks, scan and all of that, and still be able to use the Agbo to do the Agbebi and all of that. So we can think about what that actually means, right, in contemporary times. I think we're out of time.
I'm sorry, can you allow me to respond to Flourish?
Yes, please.
Okay.
And if we get cut off, thank you, everyone. So go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Initially, when the missionaries came, their focus was on women. And so there was this slogan, convert the woman, convert the girls, then the whole community will be converted to Christianity. So as a result of this, they were able to establish missionary schools, seminary schools, and they tried to train girls and women to be responsible wives and mother. So we have a lot of missionary maternity care, but relating it to contemporary time, then as history itself is dynamic, we have men that were Esikiawu, but the interplay of culture and patriarchy was dominant. So you cannot expect a man who is so fond of his culture to now buy a new culture by doing away with the tradition and decided to enroll in the midwifery school. So in contemporary time now, there is need to see to this. So more men now begin to do away with tradition in an attempt to embrace Western midwifery in order to engender maternal health. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We have now come to the end of this session. And thank you so much, Ellie, for bringing in the issue of abortion and women's story, right? And we can continue to think about what, the global maternal health framework, how that is impacting on what we have on the ground. For instance, just like the Roe v. Wade in US just being overturned, the pro-life, pro-choice rhetoric, right? And how that is, in a way, impacting the laws that we have in Nigeria, and how the law is functioning or not functioning. But I think it's also interesting for me to say that the traditional midwives also provide abortion services, and women are able to open up with them, and they have their means as well. That's something I'm also finding. So these things are connected, and I think we're all connected in trying to improve maternal health and reduce maternal mortality using indigenous approaches, traditional approaches, and not just relying on the globalized modern framework that hasn't really helped us so far, because it seems like the numbers keep going up, and we can also see that everyone would know a woman who has died, trying to give birth, or pregnancy-related complications, abortion-related complications. And we can see that there's a need to open up this approach and also acknowledge, right, the impact and the contribution of traditional indigenous birthing framework. And this is the work that we are all doing, and I'm grateful. Thank you to everyone who has attended. And I think we have now come to the end of our session. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists. Thank you.